I do want to talk about Easter myths, and I've had a lot of experience dealing with people who have all sorts of views about the Christian faith. One of the funnest things my wife and I ever did when we were in Australia was run these skeptic nights in our home, where we would have people over who weren't sure what to make of the Christian faith, and they'd come and we would go through the Christian faith over sort of 6 Wednesday evenings in a row, and people would have the opportunity to ask their questions. It was a wonderful thing to do, and I remember one particular course, on night 1, there was this very vocal, intelligent, articulate woman. This is not an actual photo of her, but it does capture the vibe, who from night 1 was saying, "That's stupid." I would say stuff, and she would go, "That's stupid." Now, that's not quite as rude as it sounds in America. In Australia, you can sort of say that. But it's not like super polite anyway. She said, "If there were evidence, I'd believe, but there's no evidence, so I don't believe." I tried my best to give her intellectual answers to her very good intellectual questions, but really nothing I could say would change her mind. Even in weeks 3 and 4, she was saying, "It's stupid." But after week 4, after the formalities, I was just having a quiet drink with her as the conversation continued, and she told me her real gripe against the Christian faith was this auntie she grew up with, who was a Christian and a bully. By the sounds of it, one of those self-righteous, mean-spirited Christians that don't just live in the movies. And she said that put me right off the whole thing. I then, of course, said, "But hang on, for the last 4 weeks you've been telling me it's all about evidence. It's just evidence. And now you're saying it's because you've had a bad experience." And she very honestly said, "It's both. It's both." And I was very struck that evening by her honesty and the insight that for lots of people, it doesn't come down to evidence. It's not all about evidence. Evidence will play a part. That's why sometimes a talk like this has a place. But other things factor in, including our experiences, our assumptions, and our preferences. Now, I say all that, not being a mind reader, but supposing there'll be people in here for whom evidence is an issue, but for others for whom it's not really. It's my experience of Christianity that keeps me from it. Maybe. But what I want to do is talk about 3 myths that come up at Easter time that I see everywhere that keep people from taking Christianity seriously. And the first myth is that the Easter festival isn't even originally Christian. It's a rebadged pagan festival. Now, I don't know how big this is in America, but I've seen the Twitter sphere, and that seems to be international. But I tell you, it's a big deal in Australia. Every year, there'll be some article like this one from Australia's national broadcaster, the ABC. This is like the BBC, except not as good. And they brought out this Easter article in which, in part, they said, "On Easter Sunday, a bunny will deliver chocolates to many households across Australia. Have you ever wondered how this seemingly bizarre tradition came to be? Well, it turns out Easter actually began as a pagan festival celebrating spring in the Northern Hemisphere, long before the advent of Christianity." And there is this meme that goes around this time of year without fail, this one here, that actually names the pagan god and festival that Easter comes from. Have you ever wondered where all this nonsense about Easter bunnies and hiding coloured eggs came from, and what it has to do with the magic zombie, that's Jesus, crawling out of the hole smelling lemony fresh? Ask Erstra. She's a pagan goddess of light and fertility, and bunnies and eggs are pagan symbols of fertility. There is about as much evidence for her myth as there is for the myth of Jesus' resurrection. The whole thing comes from the goddess Erstra, the Anglo-Saxon goddess Erstra. The whole thing comes from a giant misunderstanding of something said by the 8th century churchman and intellectual, the Venerable Bede, often regarded as the father of English history. And in his book, The Reckoning of Time, he describes, in the 8th century, living in England, what the old Anglo-Saxon months were called, because they didn't go by January, February, March, April, May, etc. They had their own Anglo-Saxon months. And he says that one of those months was called Erstemonath, and that this word comes from an even more ancient Anglo-Saxon deity, Erstra. It is Erstra's month. And then he says, this is the word that local Anglo-Saxons gave to the Christian festival. They called it Easter because it fell in the Erstemonath, the month of Erster. Now, just so you know I'm not making this up, here's your primary source, the only one you need, because the entire myth comes from this paragraph. Here's Bede. Nor is it irrelevant if we take the trouble to translate the names of the other months, the Anglo-Saxon months. The month Solmonath can be called month of cakes, which they offered to their gods in that month. The month Thrithmonath is named for their god Thritha, to whom they sacrificed at this time. The month Erstemonath has a name which we now call the Paschal month, and which month was once called after a goddess of theirs named Erstra, in whose honour feasts were celebrated in that month. Now they designate that Paschal season by her name, Easter. Notice, Bede isn't saying the Christian festival comes from the pagan festival, let alone from the pagan god. He's just saying that local Anglo-Saxons gave the Christian festival the name Easter because it fell in the Easter month, the Erstemonath. That's all he's saying. It's just like March, the month we're in now, right? It's actually named after the god Mars, the god of war. June is named after Juno. And no one's sitting around thinking, wow, we're in the god of war's month now. And I was introduced to March Madness by one of my students. I believe it's a thing, right? I've caught a little bit of it. It seems pretty cool to me. But no one's thinking of March Madness as that festival in honor of the god of war, Mars. Although I guess there are some similarities between war and the March Madness. My point is, skeptics could have avoided this whole misunderstanding if they'd actually read what Bede had said and had realised that the word Easter, the festival Easter, already had a name and a history much older than the new term Easter. It used to be called Pascha. In fact, Bede refers to it as the Paschal celebration. That's what Easter was called in all of the lands of Christian origins before it got to Germany and England. If you say Easter in France, they don't have a clue what you're talking about unless they also speak English. Because in all the other lands, it's actually called something to do with Pascha, meaning the Jewish Passover. I'm not making this up either. In Hebrew today, it is still called Pesach, Passover, and they mean Easter. Jewish Passover and Christian Easter are both called Pesach. In Italian, it's called Pasqua, from the same word. In Greek, Pascha. In, where are we up to? There's Italian. In Spanish, it's Pascua. Yeah? In French, it's Pâques. Even the Swedes, good on the Swedes, they call it Påsk. Påsk. All from the one word, Passover. This whole nonsense about Christianity's chief festival deriving from paganism is an etymological dead end that should never really have been taken. It's called Pascha. That's the true name for Easter. And it reminds us of the origins of Easter. In the Passover of the early 30s AD, during which Jesus was executed. And of course, this tells us the original meaning of the first Easter, the first Pascha. The principal meaning is that just as God's judgment on ancient Egypt passed over the Israelites through the Passover lamb, so God's judgment can pass over us through Christ's death. There is more than etymology going on here. There is a clue to the very heartbeat of the Christian faith. But of course, this introduces the second myth. As soon as they say Jesus died on a cross for us, you sometimes hear people describe this as cosmic child abuse. I know some atheist writers who describe it exactly like this. Richard Dawkins, Michel Onfray, Sam Harris, and plenty of others. The idea here is God is punishing an innocent third party for what we have done. It is therefore macabre and atrocious. But this is a basic factual misunderstanding of how Christians always described the meaning of Easter. In fact, what Jesus described as the meaning of Easter, Jesus didn't call himself a third-party victim to a punishing God. No, he is God the Son, the second person of the Trinity, in unison with God. It is God himself, not a third party, bearing our judgment. Actually, I got to put this criticism. Just on Monday, I interviewed Fleming Rutledge, who's one of your finest authors and theologians. I was stunned in my interview with her. And she's written pretty much the definitive volume on the meaning of the death of Jesus. And I interviewed her and I put this very myth to her.
The skeptical complaint will be, Jesus is the third party who was dealt this blow by God in order to let us off the hook.
I see. All right. All right. Well, there again, that was just a gigantic mistake, which is actually quite easy to correct, but people don't correct it because they don't know. It's just really pathetically sad that we ever got into this way of thinking. Jesus is not some victim being sacrificed by a sadistic father. Jesus is the second person of the Blessed Trinity. The Trinity is acting all as one. God is dying there. The Holy Spirit is part of this. There are three persons here. Jesus is dying as part of the Godhead. He and the Father and the Spirit are doing this together from the beginning of all creation and before. This is something that God is. God is three in himself, three-personed. God is love within himself. There are three persons sharing love within themselves. And these three persons together are sacrificing. Is God sacrificing God? Well, in a sense, yes.
In other words, what happened on the cross is not a judge looking at guilty people but picking on a third-party innocent victim. No. It is as if the judge stepped off the bench, lived the life we could never live, and then paid the penalty himself for us. Which just leaves the third, greatest and most difficult of the myths at Easter. Myth number 3, historians can't take the resurrection seriously. You will find articles this Easter in the Washington Post and New York Times and elsewhere basically saying the whole thing is a myth and we can't take it seriously. So let me offer a few thoughts about the other side of Jesus' death, the resurrection. And I want to begin with an unusual quotation that sounds like it was written by a Christian, except concerning the resurrection of Jesus on Easter Sunday, I was for decades a denier. I am no longer a denier, since the following deliberation has caused me to think this through anew. When these peasants, shepherds and fishermen who betrayed and denied their master and then failed him miserably suddenly could be changed overnight into a confident mission society, convinced of salvation and able to work with much more success after Easter than before Easter, then no vision or hallucination is sufficient to explain such a revolutionary transformation. If the defeated and depressed group of disciples could overnight change into a victorious movement of faith based only on autosuggestion or self-deception without a fundamental faith experience, then this would be a much greater miracle than the resurrection itself. In a purely logical analysis, the resurrection of Jesus is the lesser of two evils for all those who seek a rational explanation of the worldwide consequences of that Easter faith. Not written by a Christian apologist or clergyman or Christian scholar of any kind, but by the late, great Pinchas Lapid, an important professor from Bar-Ilan University in Israel and an expert in ancient history. And he turned his attention as a Jew, not a Christian, to the resurrection of Jesus and wrote a great book about it in which he concluded exactly that. The last part of the book explains why he's not going to become a Christian now, and he's got an ingenious way. Maybe you can ask me about that in the question time. But he's confident the history is on the side of the resurrection. Now, quoting Pinchas Lapid doesn't prove anything, but it does illustrate the resurrection of Jesus is taken way more seriously than it seems the Washington Post and the New York Times realize. Genuine scholars working in mainstream secular history are writing about the resurrection as a serious historical question. Not just Lapid, but an Oxford Symposium of papers, The Resurrection of the Son of God, an atheist book written by Gerd Ludemann, an atheist, The Resurrection of Christ, Jewish professor Geza Vermesh, highly skeptical professor Bruce Chilton, and Dale Allison's most recent volume is a fine, 2021, is a fine volume for those of you who are nerdy and into history. I can't recommend that one highly enough. All I'm saying is mainstream scholars think that the resurrection is not a story from Middle Earth, the land of the Hobbit and so on. It's part of the history of the Middle East. And they discuss it as such. And there are two reasons why the resurrection is taken seriously. And I'll give you these two reasons as quickly as I can, and then I'll sit down and happily field your questions. Number one, the tomb in which Jesus was laid was very probably found empty. That's a statement that could be made in universities around the world, not just the safe place of Wheaton College, and wouldn't raise an eyebrow. The tomb in which Jesus was laid was very probably found empty. The reasons for this are pretty compelling. One, it's mentioned in 3 separate sources that haven't been copied from one another. 2, there's very good evidence that the first critics of Christianity in Jerusalem said that the disciples stole the body from the tomb, which tells the modern historian everyone accepted there was an empty tomb, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't have said, you stole the body from the tomb. They all agreed there was an empty tomb. They just disagreed how it got that way. And the third reason for it being very probable there was an empty tomb is that the reports about the discovery of the empty tomb all come from women. Now, that may not seem like very interesting to you. I mean, you might be thinking, yeah, of course the women found it first for various reasons. But you need to think like an ancient person, not like a modern person. Did you know that a woman's testimony in antiquity was heavily discounted, often not even allowed in a court of law? I'm sorry to even read out these words in a place like Wheaton, which is so much for the progress of women in the world, but here are some ancient texts for you. From women, let no evidence be accepted because of the levity and temerity of their sex. Or from the Mishnah, the law governing an oath of testimony applies to men and not to women, to those who are suitable to bear witness and not to those who are unsuitable to bear witness. here's the point, and it presses in on even highly skeptical scholars. If you were making up a story about the discovery of an empty tomb and you wanted first century people to believe it, you would not make women the chief witnesses unless that just happened to be true. It's a conclusion not reached just by Christian apologists, but even by the greats like Kvamme, professor of Jewish studies for 30 years at Oxford University, and not a Christian. He wrote, "From these various records, two reasonably convincing points merge, one positive, the other negative. First, the women belonging to the entourage of Jesus discovered an empty tomb and were definite that it was the tomb. Second, the rumor that the apostles stole the body is most improbable." That's the first reason the resurrection is taken seriously. There was very likely an empty tomb, but I'm well aware that an empty tomb can be interpreted in a number of ways, including the very first interpretation of the empty tomb. The apostles stole the body. Actually, it's a second fact in tandem with this first fact that leads historians today to at least take this resurrection story more seriously than many skeptical people do. Here is the second fact. From the beginning, people sincerely claimed to have seen the risen Jesus. My wording is very precise. From the beginning, people sincerely claimed to have seen the risen Jesus. So how do we know it was A, from the beginning, and B, sincere? Because there may be two big claims. Well, the early date can be guaranteed from this passage. This letter comes from the 50s AD, so we're now about 25 or 30 years after Jesus. But the bit in yellow on the screen is a quotation from a much earlier creed, which even atheist scholars like Gerd Ludemann and agnostic scholars like Robert Funk agree came within months of the events themselves. That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. We can date this either to 3132, the AD 3132, or 3334. Either way, before 35. Which in ancient history is about as good as something gets. When I was much younger, I got to handle the oldest copy of this very fragment in a vault in the library in Dublin Castle. And don't freak out that this looks like my younger brother. Just imagine that it is my younger brother.
In this glass frame is the earliest example of Christian oral tradition. Here, the Apostle Paul reminds the Corinthians of a fixed summary of the Christian faith, which he passed on to them years earlier, and which he himself had received shortly after his conversion.
Mainstream scholars date this summary to within months of Jesus' death.
Hoti Christos apethenen huper ton hamartion hemon katatas graphas. That Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures. Kai hoti etaphe, and that he was buried. Kai hoti egergatai te hemera te trite katatas graphas, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. Kai hoti ofther kerpha eta tois dodeca, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12.
These words were in common Christian usage before the year 35.
Whatever else we may want to say about the basic plot of Jesus' life, it clearly wasn't a legend growing up over time.
This fixed summary, or creed, provides evidence that the broad narrative of Jesus' death, burial, resurrection and appearances was being taught and memorised decades before the details were written up in the Gospels.
My point is, the resurrection cannot be an evolving legend. That is ruled out from the get-go. It's an instant something. because we can date the first testimony about it to within, as I say, months or maybe just a few years. It's early, but why do I say it's sincere? Because we know what happened to the key eyewitnesses. See, if the key eyewitnesses suddenly became rich and famous, you know, and were given the keys to the Vatican and all the treasures down below, we might be suspicious. But you may be aware that didn't happen. We know that the key eyewitnesses suffered for their testimony. They lost social status, they lost property, they lost liberty. And we have very good evidence for at least 4 of the key eyewitnesses that they were executed for their claim that Jesus is the risen Lord. Now you might say back to me, but don't devotees die for things they merely believe in all the time? The answer is yes, of course. But these are the people who knew if the cause were fabricated or not. It's very different. For my Christian faith, it tells you that I was sincere. That's all it tells you. Oh, wow, he really must have believed it if he died for it. But it doesn't tell you anything about the facts of the case. But these are the people who said, I have seen him. And they died with that claim on their lips. And that's why we can conclude pretty firmly they sincerely thought they had seen the risen Jesus. Here's Ed Sanders, who warms a bench at the skeptical end of scholarship, recently passed away. Very sad. He was at Duke University for 30 years. He wrote, I do not regard deliberate fraud as a worthwhile explanation. Many of the people in these lists of witnesses were to spend the rest of their lives proclaiming that they had seen the risen Lord, and several of them would die for their cause. That Jesus' followers, and later Paul, had resurrection experiences is, in my judgment, a fact. What the reality was that gave rise to the experiences, I do not know. I have always loved that quotation because he's just being a good, responsible historian. He's saying, look, something very strange happened. We have very early, widespread evidence that people sincerely thought they saw him. I don't know what explains that, and it's above my pay grade to attempt it. That's what he's saying. And frankly, this is the same broad conclusion reached by Pinchas Lapid, as quoted earlier. It's the same conclusion reached by Geza Vermesh. It's hard to emphasize how important a scholar Geza Vermesh was. He was one of the principal translators of the Dead Sea Scrolls. He'd written 7 books on Jesus' life. And in those books, he had hinted at what he thought about maybe the resurrection. So when he published in 2008 the book, The Resurrection, we all raced out. All the scholars raced out to get what the great Geza Vermesh thought about the resurrection. And in 250 pages, he just told us what he'd told us in the previous 7 books in hint form. But he laid it out. And he essentially said what I've just told you. There was an empty tomb. And plenty of people sincerely thought they saw him again. And that is where history leads us. It is a myth that historians can't take the resurrection seriously. They can. And the thing is, they do. But we can't go further than that. All we can say, responsibly, is that we have exactly the kind of evidence a resurrection would leave behind. And much more evidence pointing in that direction than we would expect if it were a mistake, a legend, or a fraud. What we do with this depends not on evidence. It depends on all those other factors that play into our opinions, which leads me back to one of the first things I said. Our views about Christ are only partly informed by intellectual evidence. Equally influential are our assumptions, our experiences, and even our preferences. And this really came home to me when I became friends with this woman, Professor Kirsty Barhartz. She was a professor of music. Actually, a professor of the physics of music, which is like even nerdier. and an ardent atheist. And one day she was Googling something on science, because she's very much into science, physics in particular. And one of the results, and I regard this as a miracle, one of the Google results was a series of talks called God and Science at my church in Roseville in Sydney, where we'd got Dr. David Wally, who's got a Ph.D. in biophysics from Duke University, gave a series of talks. And she clicked on those talks and listened to all 3 45-minute talks. And then she turned up secretly to my little church. And that's when I met her. She said, I came across these talks. I thought I'd come to this church and ask my questions. Would that be okay? Of course, I said. Fire away. She had questions. Woof. She heard about a course that we run in our home. The course I mentioned at the outset, actually. Same course. It was a different course from the previous woman, but in our home. Kirsty came. It was hilarious. I mean, Kirsty is used to being the smartest person in every room. And she had to hold herself back from asking question after question after question. By week 2, she had read all 4 Gospels. Now, you were only meant to read 6 chapters of one of the Gospels. She finished all 4 of them. So I knew I was in for something. Weeks 3, 4, 5, 6 went past. She asked tons of questions. She had moral questions. She had questions about the hurts that she'd suffered. But she also had these massive intellectual questions. She started to read voraciously. She read more books, I'd say, than most second-year seminary students ever read, just in the month after it. And after we ended the course, she said, I want to have a sit down with you and fire my questions at you. I'm going to write my questions to you. Would that be okay? She wrote me a letter. More like an essay, because this letter had footnotes. So anyway, it was like 10 or 15 pages long. It was a monster. And it just sat on my desk, because it was so good. It just sat on my desk and thinking, I'm going to give that, a couple of hours to reply to eventually. And a month went by. And I hadn't replied. And I thought, oh no, this is terrible. And then I rang her up and I said, I'm so sorry. How about we go out for that coffee and we'll discuss all your questions? And she said, no, it's okay. I don't need that anymore. My first thought, of course, was, oh no, she's chucked the whole thing in. She's not interested anymore. She said, I think I might have become a Christian. And I was like, what? Without me? No, I didn't say that. I was thinking, what? She said, I was rereading Luke's gospel. She'd read those biographies of Jesus over and over. And she said, I was rereading Luke's gospel and I got to the parable of the Good Samaritan. By the end of that, she said to me, I was overwhelmed that the person who taught this parable was the source of compassion, and more than that, he loved me. Does that sound like I've become a Christian? I said, yes, it does. We still caught up. She had some questions that now were sort of second and third priorities. She had some intellectual questions answered. But the thing is, she had met Jesus Christ. Now, actually, she is such a nerd. She has recently finished her 2nd Ph.D. This was on the intersection of physics, music, and theology. There are answers to all the myths, to all the criticisms that might be laid at the Christian faith. I really believe that. The longer I am a Christian, the more convinced I am that there is no question you could put to the Christian faith that hasn't been answered by some nerd in some book, in some library somewhere. But I don't think it all comes down to evidence. Other factors play a part. So my best advice, not really knowing where you're at, is pick up a gospel this Easter. Pick up one of the biographies of Jesus. They're called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, unimaginatively titled after the people who wrote them. Read it. Because what happened to Kirsty might just happen to you. Not just intellectual answers, but you might actually meet Jesus Christ and know his overwhelming love. Thank you very much.